Dearborn, Michigan. Christmas, 1915. Snow blankets the ground. On the banks of the Rouge River, a limestone fortress rises out of a frozen forest. 56 rooms, massive windows facing the water, granite shipped from Europe, teak wood brought from Burma. It looks like a home, but in reality, it was a machine of control. This is Fair Lane, the private estate of Henry Ford, the man who changed the world with the assembly line. But what he built here was not meant to impress. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore, with its 250 rooms, to announce to the world, "I am wealthy." John D. Rockefeller built Kikuit to draw New York's elite into carefully staged garden parties. But Ford? Ford built Fair Lane to isolate, to control, to create a perfect world where human beings functioned like parts of a machine. And this was not just a house, it was a prototype, a blueprint for an empire. From the tightly monitored workers, streets of Dearborn, to an entire city carved into the Amazon rainforest, a place where Ford believed he could redesign nature itself. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, and the dark stories hidden behind luxury and beauty, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We're building a documentary series about the true cost of perfection. Because this video is not a real estate tour, it is a technical autopsy. We're not just going to look at what was built, we're going to ask why it was built this way. The numbers behind the beauty, the tunnels beneath the floors, the rules that govern the lives of thousands of workers. And what remains when the ambition to control human beings collides with the chaos of reality. To understand this story, we have to begin with what still stands today. Step inside Fair Lane as it exists today, a mansion abandoned for decades, where dust settles on machines once designed to run flawlessly. The year is 2024, the same place, on the banks of the Rouge River. Fair Lane is still standing, but it is no longer a machine. The teak doors are cracked. The European granite has weathered into a dull gray. The massive windows, once blazing with electric light in 1915, now reflect an empty sky. Inside, dust settles on machines that once ran flawlessly. Ford's custom climate control system, designed to regulate the temperature of each individual room, is now nothing more than rusted pipes. The internal telephone network that once connected every corner of the house, silent for decades. And the hydroelectric power plant, the heart of this entire machine, stopped beating on the night Henry Ford died. April 13, 1947. A spring storm sweeps across Michigan. The Rouge River rises and spills over its banks. Floodwaters surge into Ford's power plant. The lights inside Fair Lane go out. Henry Ford, now 83 years old, his eyesight failing, his hearing nearly gone, moves through the darkness by candlelight. The machine he built to never fail has failed. He dies a few hours later, in a darkened bedroom, like millions of people before the age of electricity. The irony is brutal. The man who brought light to millions of homes through the Model T and cheap power plants dies in darkness because his own private electrical system collapses. But Fair Lane was built to last forever. That was the intention. In 1914, when Ford began construction, he told his architects, "I want a place that is completely self-sufficient. No reliance on the city's power grid, no dependence on public water systems, no submission to anyone else's control." He built his own dam on the Rouge River, installed hydroelectric turbines capable of powering an entire neighborhood, dug deep wells for an independent water supply, planted vegetable gardens, raised livestock, even built his own food processing facilities on the estate. The cost? About $2.9 million in 1915, nearly $90 million in today's money. But to Ford, this was not luxury, it was necessity. He had seen what dependence could do. He grew up on a poor farm, where winter meant darkness by 4 in the afternoon, where a failed harvest meant hunger, where survival depended on forces you could not control. Ford hated that. So he built Fair Lane as a fortress against chaos, a place where everything, from the lights in the ceiling to the water in the taps, was governed by systems he designed. A house where nothing could fail, except everything did. After Ford's death, Fair Lane sat abandoned for nearly 40 years. The family did not want it. Too large, too expensive to maintain, too heavy with the memory of a man who could not let go. The intricate systems Ford built, designed to last forever, began to collapse. Roofs leaked. Water crept into the walls. Rats nested in the underground tunnels, once used by servants. Yet beneath the dust and decay, the blueprints remain. The turbines still sit in the dam. The tunnels still run beneath the floors. And if you know how to look, you can still see exactly how this machine was meant to work. To understand why Ford built this way, why every detail, every system, every tunnel was part of a larger plan, we have to look at the original blueprint, not the architectural one, the psychological one. 1914. Before Fair Lane is built. Henry Ford stands on the bank of the Rouge River with his architects. He points at the fast-moving water. "Start here," he says. Not with the house foundation, with the power plant. Because Fair Lane was not designed as a luxury home. It was designed as an industrial facility, a factory that produced control. Ford's hydroelectric dam on the Rouge River generated 320 kilowatts of electricity, enough to light roughly 500 average homes in 1915, enough to run every system inside Fair Lane. Electric lights in every room, central heating, an elevator, and an internal telephone network connecting all 56 rooms. The cost of building that power plant? About $400,000. More than $12 million in today's money, just for electricity. But Ford didn't care about cost, he cared about independence. If Detroit's city grid failed, storm, strike, anything, Fair Lane would still glow. No one could switch off his light, except nature. And we've already seen what happens when nature pushes back. But the electrical system was only the surface. Under Fair Lane, literally, was a tunnel network linking every building on the property. The carriage house, storage buildings, the garage, the power plant, and the main house. These tunnels were 6 feet wide and 8 feet high, wide enough for a man to pull a cart through. Inside ran water pipes, electrical lines, steam heat pipes, and people. The staff, housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, mechanics, moved through these tunnels. They carried food from kitchen to dining room. They hauled coal from storage to the furnaces. They repaired systems without ever disturbing the owner. This is the core of the labor audit, the part most Fair Lane stories skip. Bridget, the head housekeeper, worked 15-hour days. Her pay, $900 a year, about $27,000 in today's money. Thomas, the head gardener, maintained 240 acres of grounds. His pay, $750 a year, about $23,000 today. In the basement, room-sized boilers burned coal to generate steam heat. Each boiler held 500 gallons of water. The internal temperature, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. In a Michigan winter, these boilers ran 18 hours a day. Someone had to shovel coal. Someone had to watch the pressure. Someone had to make sure it didn't explode. That someone was not Henry Ford. This is what Ford learned from the assembly line. Efficiency comes from breaking every process into simple, repeatable steps. At the factory, one worker installs a steering wheel. Another worker installs a tire. At Fair Lane, one servant carries plates. One feeds the furnace. One cuts the grass. No one sees the whole system. No one holds power. No one can strike alone. He applied mass production thinking to family life. And from a technical standpoint, it worked beautifully. Fairlane produced its own power, its own water, its own heat, even much of its food. The systems ran like a clock. Nothing broke, nothing drifted out of control, except the human beings. Because Ford missed one variable when he designed this perfect machine. People are not machine parts. They think. They have families. They have lives outside the tunnels. And Ford didn't just want to control their labor. He wanted to control how they lived. To do that, he needed more than a mansion. He needed a neighborhood, a full community, where every detail of life, from how you scrub your floors to what you drink, is dictated by a 120-page rulebook. 3 miles east of Fairlane, Dearborn, Michigan, 1919. 500 small houses, nearly identical. Each one, 2 bedrooms, a living room, a kitchen, and a tiny backyard. No fences, no hedges, no places to hide. This is where Ford's workers lived. The men assembling the Model T, the hands running the line, the people who turned Henry Ford into a billionaire. And just like Fairlane, these homes were not designed for comfort. They were designed for control. In 1914, Ford created something most factories didn't have, a sociological department. 50 inspectors, all men, all American, were paid for one job, to inspect how workers lived. Not how they worked, how they lived. Every week, they arrived without warning. They stepped into your home. They checked how clean the floors were. They opened your icebox. They counted how many people lived there. They questioned your wife about spending. And they wrote it all down. And if you failed the standard, you lost the $5 day, the highest wage in the industry at that time. $5 a day. Roughly $150 a day in today's money. But it wasn't a gift, it was a contract. And the terms were written in a 120-page handbook titled Helpful Hints and Advice to Employees. That sounds friendly, doesn't it? Here is what it actually said. Rule 1. The use of alcohol, in any form, is grounds for immediate discharge. No exceptions. No beer after a shift. No whiskey on Christmas. If an inspector smelled alcohol on your breath, or your wife's, you were gone. Next. Rule 2. The home must be kept clean to the company's standard. Floors swept daily. Sinks shining. Beds made immediately. They checked. They ran a finger across the windowsill to find dust. Rule 3. The employee must save at least 5% of income. The passbook must be shown to an inspector on request. Ford didn't just control your wage. He controlled how you spent it. Rule 4. Single men must marry or live with family. A single life is considered immoral. Rule 5. No boarders, no renting rooms. The family must live alone. Because if you took in a boarder, you could share expenses, and if you shared expenses, you depended on Ford less. Rule 6. Employees must attend company English and citizenship classes. Absence will not be accepted. That was Ford's definition of helpful advice. And if you didn't comply, inspectors marked you unfit. You were dropped to a lower wage. Or fired outright. But here's the cruel part. The system worked. Not because workers wanted it. Because they didn't have a real choice. $5 a day was double what other factories paid. With that money, a family could escape poverty, send kids to school, buy fresh food instead of whatever was cheapest. So they endured. They swept floors daily. They kept the savings book. They smiled at the inspectors. They drank coffee instead of beer. They became perfect parts inside Ford's machine. Bridget, the head housekeeper at Fairlane, had a sister in Ford's factory. Her name was Margaret. Margaret and her husband lived in one of these model homes. They never drank. They never let inspectors find dust. They followed every rule for 12 years. And when her husband was injured at the plant in 1926, 3 fingers taken by a stamping machine, they received no compensation because the accident was labeled worker negligence. Margaret kept working for another 15 years because the family needed the money. That is the real cost of Ford's perfect system. But there was one person inside Ford's empire who couldn't endure this kind of control. Someone who tried to build something different, a home where he could breathe. And that person was Henry Ford's son. Grosse Pointe Shores, Michigan, 1929, 10 miles east of Fair Lane on the shore of Lake St. Clair. A house that looks like it was borrowed from the English countryside. A stone-shingled roof, rough brick walls, tall chimneys, small windows framed in oak. No straight lines, no symmetry, no system. This is Gawkler Point, Edsel Ford's home, and every detail is a protest. Henry Ford built Fair Lane like a fortress. Edsel built Gawkler Point like an escape. Henry believed in straight lines, systems, efficiency. Edsel loved curves, art, beauty. Henry wanted machines. Edsel wanted people. The cost to build Gawkler Point? About $2 million in 1929, nearly $40 million in today's money. Edsel hired Albert Kahn, the greatest architect in Detroit, to design a house his father would hate. And he succeeded. Henry hated it. He called it a dollhouse. He said it was too soft. He refused to visit for years. And Edsel? He smiled and kept collecting art. It feels like a victory, doesn't it? The son escapes the father's control, builds his own life. Except there's one problem. Edsel didn't have money. I mean, he had money. Millions. But every dollar came from Henry Ford. Edsel's salary as president of Ford Motor Company? $50,000 a year, about $800,000 today. It sounds huge until you realize the boss was his father, and president was just a title. Every major decision? Henry made it. Every product strategy? Henry approved it. And every time Edsel tried to innovate, design better-looking cars, improve working conditions, invest in new technology, Henry shut it down. Publicly, in front of other executives. In 1941, Edsel wanted to move on from the aging Model T and push modern designs. Henry said no. In 1937, Edsel tried to negotiate with unions to avoid violence. Henry hired private security to beat striking workers. In 1942, Edsel proposed deeper cooperation with the U.S. government during World War II. Henry nearly cut off defense contracts. Each time Edsel backed down, because if he didn't, Henry could fire him, cut his pay, take everything, including Gawkler Point. So Edsel lived in his beautiful house. He collected art, he hosted dinners, he pretended he was free. But every night, looking out across Lake St. Clair, he knew the truth. He built an escape, but he couldn't escape the man controlling his life. Architecture can't free you without financial independence, and Henry Ford understood that perfectly. That's why he controlled workers' wages. That's why he controlled his son's salary. Money isn't just money, it's power, and power is control. Edsel Ford dies in 1943. He is only 49. Official cause: stomach cancer. But everyone around him knew another truth. Stress, pressure, never being good enough for a father who was always disappointed. Henry Ford lives 4 more years after his son dies. He never apologizes, never admits what he did, and he never changes. But before Edsel died, Henry Ford had already begun a project he believed would prove he was right about everything. A place where he could build a perfect system that no one, not even his son, could ruin. A place so far away that no one could escape. He found it deep in the Amazon rainforest. And he named it after himself, Fordlandia. Tapajos River, Brazil, 1,928, 2.5 million acres of the Amazon rainforest, a territory larger than the entire state of Connecticut. Henry Ford bought it for $125,000, about $2.2 million in today's money. That's the price of a big farm in Michigan. But this wasn't going to be a farm. This was going to be a city, a perfect American city, in the middle of the rainforest, 4,000 miles from Dearborn. Ford named it Fordlandia. And like Fair Lane, like the worker streets of Dearborn, it began with a blueprint. That blueprint looked like this. A rigid street grid, like Manhattan, like Detroit, cut straight through rainforest. Blocks numbered, intersections at perfect right angles. 300 American-style houses, oak framing, tin roofs, front porches, the same kind of homes you'd see in Michigan. A 100-bed hospital, a school with 6 classrooms, a diesel-powered electric plant, a rubber processing factory fitted with industrial machinery shipped from Akron, Ohio. And every piece of it, every plank, every sheet of tin, every nail, was shipped from Michigan. 4,000 miles, down the St. Lawrence, across the Atlantic, along Brazil's coast, up the Amazon, to the Tapajos River. Shipping costs in the first year? Millions of dollars. The exact number was never released, because even Ford was embarrassed by it. But Ford didn't care about cost. He cared about principle. He would prove the American method, efficiency, process, discipline, could work anywhere. Even in a place where temperatures hit 110 degrees Fahrenheit, where 90% humidity turns steel into rust in weeks, where rainforest downpours can chew through concrete in a single season. This was the reality Ford's blueprint didn't account for. But Ford didn't listen to his engineers. He didn't ask Brazilians who knew the land. He didn't study tropical climate. He gave one order: build it like the plan. And they built it. Hundreds of Brazilian laborers, hired with promises of high wages, cut down rainforest, leveled ground, poured concrete in punishing heat. They built Fordlandia. By 1930, it looked complete. An American town in the Amazon. Straight streets, neat houses, electric lights, running water. All the conveniences of civilization. But there was one problem, a big problem: rubber trees. Ford planted 3 million rubber trees. Same species, same age, same spacing, in straight lines like an assembly line. In nature, rubber trees grow scattered through the rainforest, far apart, mixed among hundreds of other species. There's a reason for that. When you plant millions of identical trees close together, you don't create efficiency. You create a buffet. Leaf fungus, boring insects, black mold. They jump from tree to tree, and they spread in weeks. Brazilian scientists warned Ford. Botanists wrote letters. But Ford didn't trust experts. He trusted his system. He believed discipline could beat biology. That order could defeat nature. He was wrong. Fordlandia wasn't a town. It was an experiment to see if human will could overpower nature. And the experiment was failing. But Ford forgot something even more dangerous than biology. He forgot the men living in Fordlandia weren't machines. They had limits. They had needs. And when you push them too far in the furnace heat of the Amazon, when you force them to eat American food their stomachs can't handle, work 12-hour shifts in deadly temperatures, and live by the rules of strangers, eventually they revolt. Fordlandia, December 1930. 2 years after construction is complete. On the outside, everything looks perfect. Clean streets, straight houses, electric lights turning on like clockwork. But inside the communal dining hall, something is boiling. Temperature, 112 degrees Fahrenheit at noon. Humidity, 95%. Work shift, 12 hours, 6 in the morning to 6 at night. Food, shipped from Michigan, or grown the American way. This is where it begins. American managers wrote back to Dearborn. and their letters say what Ford refused to hear. Report to the Dearborn office, December 10, 1930. The laborers refuse the food provided. They claim the tomatoes are unripe and the canned spinach is inedible. We explain this is the standard diet of American workers. They are not persuaded. But the food was only the surface. They demand manioc. They demand black beans. They demand the food their mothers cooked. We told them the menu has been approved by the Ford Motor Company. They replied in Portuguese, in terms our interpreter refused to translate. But there are other accounts, from the other side of the table. They told us, eat their food or you don't get paid. That food made our stomachs burn. No manioc, no farinha, nothing that keeps a Brazilian man strong. They fed us things even pigs wouldn't touch. 12 hours in that heat. No water unless you ask permission. No break unless the whistle allows it. If you sit down, they scream at you. If you complain, they cut your pay. We were treated like animals. No, worse than animals. At least animals are fed what they can digest. December 15th, 1930. Dinner. One worker stands up. He looks down at his tray. Then he looks at the American supervisors at their separate table, eating better food. He flips the tray. What managers call a riot, what workers call resistance. 300 men had endured too long. They destroyed the dining hall, smashed windows, chased American supervisors into the rainforest. Some managers hid in the brush for 3 days. They survived on rainwater. They never returned to Fordlandia. By the next morning, Fordlandia is silent. The dining hall is wrecked. Machines stop. Workers are gone. Some walking back toward villages, some taking boats downriver. Ford tries to rebuild. He sends new managers. He promises change. He even agrees to a Brazilian menu. But it's too late. The rubber trees are dying from fungus. Workers don't trust the company. Costs explode. In 1934, Ford finally admits defeat. He abandons Fordlandia. Total cost of the project? More than $20 million. Nearly $400 million today. Total rubber produced? Not enough to make a single tire. Fordlandia isn't just a business failure. It is the final proof that there are things even Henry Ford cannot control. People, nature, and the limit of willpower when it meets reality. 13 years later, on another spring night in Michigan, Henry Ford lies in the dark. Another storm, another flood. The lights go out again at Fair Lane. And this time, no one can bring them back. In a silent room lit by a trembling candle, his heart stops. Like the machine he spent his life trying to build, Henry Ford simply powers down. Fair Lane, April 1947, 4 years after Edsel's death. Henry Ford, now 83, has become a shadow of himself. His eyesight is fading. His hearing is gone. His memory slips away, like old photographs in a forgotten archive. But he still goes to the office every day, still gives orders, still refuses to surrender control, even though he no longer seems sure what he's controlling. The company is in chaos. Edsel, the heir trained to take over, is gone. Executives clash. No one dares make a major decision, because no one knows whether Henry will overturn it. Ford Motor Company, once the model of efficiency, is bleeding money. Fair Lane is slipping too. Electrical failures become routine. Underground tunnels flood. Turbines in the dam rust. The machine is dying with the man who built it. April 7, 1947. A spring storm moves across Michigan. This is the moment we've already seen, at the beginning. But now we understand what it really means. The Rouge River rises. Floodwater pours into the hydroelectric plant, the same plant Ford built to make sure Fair Lane would never lose power. The turbines drown. The generators stop. The lights inside Fair Lane go out. Henry Ford is in his bedroom. He's gone to bed early. exhausted from a day spent trying to remember the names of men who had worked for him for 30 years. When the lights die, Clara, his wife, who has lived in this house with him for 32 years, lights a candle. The flame trembles. Shadows move across the walls. Like the century before electricity, before the Ford Motor Company, before Fair Lane, Fordlandia, before the ambition to control the world. Henry Ford watches the candle. Maybe he's remembering childhood on the farm. Maybe he's thinking about Edsel. Maybe he's thinking of nothing at all. We don't know his last thoughts. We only know that at around 11:15 p.m., his heart stops. The official cause is recorded as heart failure. 83 is a long life. But the irony is impossible to miss. The man who brought electric light to millions, who made power cheap enough for even the poorest family, dies in darkness. The man who built systems so he would never depend on anyone dies when his system fails. The man who spent a lifetime controlling everything dies when there is nothing left to control. News of his death spreads fast. Newspapers publish long editorials. Some praise him as an industrial genius. Some condemn him as a ruthless tyrant. Both are true, but everyone agrees on one thing. An era has ended. The era of men who believed sheer will could reshape the world, that a perfect system could control imperfect people, that architecture could dictate destiny. Henry Ford built an empire on that principle, and the empire begins to collapse the moment he's gone. Because there is one thing Ford never understood. A machine cannot survive without its operator. And when the operator leaves, when the one person holding everything together by sheer force of will disappears, what remains are just parts. Loose parts that don't know how to assemble themselves. Fair Lane sits empty. No one wants to live there. Fordlandia is abandoned. The rainforest is already swallowing it. And the worker streets in Dearborn? They still stand, but the sociological department was dismantled years earlier. And in the silence of those emptied places, one question hangs in the air. What do we do now with what he left behind? The answer won't come quickly. For nearly 4 decades, Fair Lane will sit in the dark. Dust will settle on machines that once ran flawlessly. Rats will nest in the tunnels. Rain will seep through the roof. And people will drive past and wonder why no one does anything, until finally, someone does. Fair Lane, 1987, 40 years after Henry Ford's death. If you stood in front of Fair Lane that year, you wouldn't see a mansion. You'd see a ruin. The west wing roof had collapsed. Rain had been soaking the walls for 4 decades. Mold spread across surfaces that were once bright white. Windows sat shattered. Down in the basement, the turbines that once powered the entire estate were sunk in mud and rust. The underground tunnels, where servants once moved unseen, were flooded and crumbling. Nature was doing what Ford feared most, taking control back. For 40 years, people suggested demolishing Fair Lane. Too expensive to fix, too large for anyone to live in, too much dark history. Some said level it and build something useful. But in 1957, the University of Michigan Dearborn acquired the Fair Lane grounds. Not to destroy it, to preserve it. At least, that was the intention. But intention and reality are two different things. For the next 30 years, Fair Lane kept collapsing. No money, no clear plan, just a building dying slowly on a college campus. Until 1987. That year, a small group decided Fair Lane deserved to be saved. Not because of Henry Ford, but because of the people who built it, the people who lived inside it. The story it still carried. They formed a committee, chased grants, hired structural engineers to assess the damage. Estimated cost to restore Fair Lane? $7 million in 1987, about $18 million today. One of the first people to walk into Fair Lane when restoration began was an archivist from the university, Maria Chen. Her job, to find and preserve any historical material still left in the building. For weeks, she moved room to room, cataloging what survived, photographing damage, collecting fragments of the past. And then, in a damp storage room on the 3rd floor, she found a box. Inside, hundreds of pages. Letters, diaries, hiring records, payroll books. Not Henry Ford's. The papers of the people who worked for him. Bridget O'Connor, the head housekeeper. She kept a diary, every day from 1915 to 1941. Thomas Sullivan, the head gardener. Weekly reports on weather, soil conditions, and the health of individual trees. Margaret Walsh, Bridget's sister, a factory worker. Letters to Bridget about life in the worker streets. Maria sat on that damp floor and read. She read about 15-hour days, about inspectors checking their homes, about pride when children could go to school, about grief when a husband was injured. She read stories Henry Ford never wanted anyone to hear. Buildings aren't just wood and stone, she later said in an interview. They're the people who lived inside them, and if we destroy the building without saving those stories, we destroy a part of ourselves. The restoration took 12 years. Not 12 years of nonstop work, 12 years of fundraising, fights, setbacks, and trying again. Craftspeople had to relearn techniques from 1914. How to carve teak in that style, how to repair stained glass without destroying it. They found things hidden inside the walls. A mason's tool. Love letters. A child's shoe from around 1920. Shames Rodriguez, a carpenter on the restoration team, said, "Every time we found something like that, we stopped, we documented it, we respected it. Because the people who left these behind, they built this place with their hands. And our job is to honor that." By 1999, Fair Lane reopened as a historical museum. Not as a monument to Henry Ford, but as proof of the people who built it, and as a reminder of the real cost of control. But the work never ends. A building like Fair Lane requires constant care. Every year comes with maintenance costs. Every year brings new problems. It isn't a perfect, happy ending. It's an ongoing project, a commitment, a responsibility. And that's the point. But Fair Lane isn't the only place facing these questions. 4,000 miles south, in the Amazon, another town is facing the same choice. Let the jungle swallow it, or find a way to turn it into something meaningful for the people living there now. Fordlandia, Brazil, 1945, 11 years after Ford abandoned the project. If Fair Lane took 40 years to collapse, Fordlandia only needed 10. The rainforest doesn't wait. Roots crack concrete in months. Termites chew through wood in years. Tropical rain strips American paint in a few seasons. By 1945, Fordlandia looks like a ghost city. Straight streets disappear under weeds. The hospital, once sterile, becomes a home for bats and snakes. The rubber processing plant sits silent, red with rust. But not everyone leaves. Some Brazilian families stayed. People who once worked for Ford, or their children, not because they loved Fordlandia, because they had nowhere else to go. And then they did something Ford never predicted. They made it theirs. They didn't ask permission. They didn't wait for anyone to save Fordlandia. They just lived. They turned an American hospital into a Brazilian hospital, with local practitioners, herbal remedies from the forest, and no rules about canned food. They turned an American school into a Brazilian school, where kids learned Portuguese, not English, where history was taught from the perspective of people who endured it, not the people who imposed it. They turned American houses into Brazilian homes, hammocks instead of beds, outdoor cooking instead of electric stoves, doors open because of heat, not because a rulebook demanded it. José Santos, born in 1940, the son of a laborer who took part in the cafeteria riot, grew up in one of those houses. My father told me about Ford, he said in a 2018 interview. He thought he could turn us into Americans. But he was wrong. We turned Fordlandia into Brazil. When I was a boy, we played inside buildings Ford made to control everything. But we didn't know what they were. To us, they were just houses, where my mother cooked, where I did my homework, where our family lived. Sometimes people come from America, Jose said. They take pictures of the old buildings. They talk about history. They ask if we're going to restore it. He laughed. Restore what? This is our home, not a museum. That doesn't mean the town doesn't respect history. They know the stories. They know their grandfathers worked 12-hour shifts in heat. They know their grandmothers fought to eat manioc instead of canned tomatoes. But for them, history isn't something you preserve behind glass. History is something you live with, and sometimes something you have to change. Today, Fordlandia is a small town of around 2,000 people. Some of Ford's buildings still stand, used for practical reasons. Some have collapsed, and no one rushes to clean it up because the forest is more useful than broken concrete. There's no restoration committee, no multi-million-dollar grant, no museum. Just people living their lives inside spaces Ford once believed he controlled. And maybe that is the best punishment for Ford's illusion of control. Not careful preservation like Fair Lane, where every detail is kept as evidence of his ambition, but the complete erasure of his vision, making Fordlandia into the thing he would have hated most. A Brazilian community, living their way, on their land, by their rules. Jose said, Ford wanted us to remember him. He wanted his name to live here forever. But my children don't even know what Fordlandia means. To them, it's just home. But there's one place in Ford's empire that isn't like Fair Lane or Fordlandia, a place that was never truly abandoned because people never left. The worker streets in Dearborn, where all of this began, are still there, and people are still living in them. That raises a different question. When history isn't the past, but the present, what do you do with it? Dearborn, Michigan. Today, 3 miles east of Fair Lane, the streets are still here. 500 small houses Henry Ford built for his workers. Most are still standing. And unlike Fair Lane or Fordlandia, they were never empty. People still live inside them. That creates a different question than the ones we've been asking. Not how do you preserve history, but how do you live with it? 2 people can help us answer that. One lives inside Ford's history. The other works with it. Let's start with the worker houses. Robert Chen, 67 years old. Robert Chen lives at 412 14th Street, one of the original worker streets. Not because he has no options. He's a retired teacher. He could move anywhere. He stays because this house has been in his family since 1922. His grandfather, Chen Wei, arrived from Guangdong in 1919. He worked at the Ford plant. He bought this house in 1922 with a loan through the company housing program. Original price, $800, about $15,000 in today's money. Current value, about $180,000. Robert's father also worked for Ford, from 1950 to 1983. He grew up in this house. He raised Robert in this house. Robert, he never worked for Ford Motor Company. He became a teacher. But he never left. Why would I? He says. This is my home. Most of the original structure is still there. The floorboards creak in the same spots his grandfather knew. The front door still sticks in the summer. It's done that since 1922. But there are changes. The kitchen was upgraded in 1986. The bathroom was remodeled in 2003. His grandfather didn't have air conditioning. Robert does. And in the basement, his grandfather's toolbox is still there. Rusty, but never thrown away. On the porch, where Robert's grandmother once watched sociological department inspectors walk by, Robert drinks coffee every morning. Same view. 100 years later. People like taking pictures of my house, he says, especially since they put up the historic marker in the 90s. But they don't ask. They just stand on the sidewalk and shoot photos. Because it's history, it's not private anymore. That's one of the strange things about living inside history. You don't own the story anymore. The story owns you. 10 miles east, another person is living with Ford's history too, but in a completely different way. Jennifer Morrison, 34 years old, museum guide. Jennifer Morrison works at the Edsel and Eleanor Ford house, the place Edsel Ford built as a quiet escape from his father. She's not a Ford descendant. She's not descended from the people who worked for them. She's just someone who loves history and chose this job. The Edsel and Eleanor Ford house opened to the public in 1978. Eleanor Ford's will asked that it become a place for education, not a place for bragging. Restoration and museum conversion cost? $3 million in 1970, about $15 million today. 40,000 visitors a year. School trips, researchers, and people like Jennifer, the ones who tell the story. Jennifer has done this for 10 years. She knows every painting in Edsel's collection, every architectural detail, every story the house is trained to carry. And she has an opening line she uses every day. Edsel Ford built this house as a whisper against his father's scream. It always works. People want more. But then, inevitably, someone asks, so how rich was Edsel? And Jennifer has to pivot from tragedy to statistics. That's the tension in her work. Most people come for beauty, the art, the Cotswold-style architecture, the gardens. Jennifer wants them to understand something deeper, that this beautiful room was once a place where a man finally felt safe, that these walls were a shield against a father who couldn't stop controlling him. That beauty isn't just something to admire. Sometimes it's something you build to survive. 6 times a day, she explains the hand-carved ebony ceiling. She explains the imported craftsman. She explains the cost. And sometimes, off-script, she adds something else. 200 people worked to keep this house running when Edsel was alive. Servants, gardeners, tradesmen. Most could never afford to live in a place 1/10 this size. The museum board doesn't love that. They want tours that feel uplifting. Donors don't like conversations about labor and class. But Jennifer, making $45,000 a year to explain a $40 million estate, can't unsee the irony. People want to admire beauty, she says in a private interview. They don't want to think about who polished those floors, who watered those gardens, who cooked those meals. And I get it. Beauty is why they come, but truth is why I stay. Back on 14th Street, Robert Chen is facing a different problem. The neighborhood is changing. Some houses have been sold. Young professionals buy them, renovate them, call it historic charm. Some are turned into Airbnbs. Sleep in a real Ford worker house. Experience history. Property values surge, and property taxes surge with them. Robert paid $4,500 in property taxes in 2024. In 2010, it was $2,000. They want to preserve history, Robert says, but they don't want the people who actually live in that history. His kids, they don't want the house. Too old, too much responsibility, too much history. They want new builds in the suburbs, big garages, and no tourists photographing their front door. My grandfather worked 40 years to own this place, Robert says, and now I'm not sure I can keep it. That's the question he carries at night. Sell now while he still has a choice, or stay until he dies and let his kids decide. History isn't something you own. It's something you carry. Sometimes it's heavy. Sometimes it's pride. It's always complicated. Jennifer doesn't have to worry about that. Gawkler Point is protected, funded, maintained, frozen in time. But she carries a different burden. The question she never says out loud on tours: is frozen in time actually the right way? Edsel dies in 1943. Eleanor dies in 1976. The house is preserved as if it's the 1940s. But they lived. They changed things. They grew. Preservation stops that. We preserve the moment Edsel died, Jennifer says, not the life he lived. And there's another detail she thinks about but rarely gets to say. The fourth floor, where the servants lived, is closed to the public. Too expensive to maintain. Not interesting enough for visitors. So they preserve beauty. They preserve Edsel's tragedy. They preserve art. But they don't preserve the people who made all of it possible. The descendants of Edsel's servants, Jennifer says, can't afford a $20 ticket to tour the house their grandparents cleaned. That irony keeps her awake. Two people, two houses, both living with Henry Ford's legacy. Robert lives inside history. He can't escape it. He can't sell it without selling a piece of his family. Every day is a negotiation between the past and the present. Jennifer works with history. She explains it. She performs it. And at the end of the day, she goes home. No one owns the story completely. And maybe that's the point. History isn't something you own. It's something you carry. Sometimes heavy, sometimes proud, always complicated. But other people aren't just living with Ford's legacy. They want to rewrite it, redefine it, use it to tell new stories. Filmmakers, students, scholars, and the curious. People who look at these buildings and see something Henry Ford never intended. And in seeing something different, they're doing the one thing Ford could never control. They're taking the story. There are people who don't just live with Ford's legacy. And they don't just preserve it. They're rewriting it. 4 people, 4 questions. All of them look at the same buildings we've been looking at and see something completely different. And in seeing something different, they're doing the one thing Henry Ford could never control. They're taking the story. Marcus Williams, 41 years old, independent documentary filmmaker, is not the kind of filmmaker Fairlane usually invites. He doesn't work for PBS. He doesn't have a Netflix deal. He doesn't have corporate sponsors. He's a son of Detroit. His grandfather worked at the Rouge plant from 1947 to 1979, 32 years on the assembly line. And 3 years ago, Marcus started a project, a documentary called The Hands That Built Ford. Funding? $180,000 from Kickstarter, small grants from local history groups, personal savings. No money from Ford Motor Company. And that is exactly the point. Every documentary about Ford starts with Henry Ford, Marcus tells me, setting his camera down after a shot. Model T, the assembly line, the industrial genius. I start with Chen Wei, with Margaret Walsh, with the names nobody remembers. His method is simple. Interview the descendants of Ford workers. Film inside their homes, not inside museums. Listen to them read letters and diaries their grandparents wrote. No polished narration. No triumphant score. Just the voices of people telling their own story. Marcus shows me a scene he's especially proud of. It's an interview with Robert Chen, the man we met on 14th Street. Marcus asks, "Did your grandfather ever meet Henry Ford?" Robert, "Never. Ford never came down to the floor." Marcus, "But your grandfather saw Model Ts being made every day." Robert pauses, then gives a small laugh. He didn't just see them. He made them, with his hands, every day, for 32 years. That's Marcus's thesis. The inversion. Henry Ford didn't build Ford Motor Company. 20,000 workers built it. Ford owned it. People tell me I'm politicizing history, Marcus says. I tell them leaving labor out is the political choice. Telling the story without the people who made it. That's propaganda. Not history. Ford Motor Company refused to give him access to film on company property. The Ford House Museum hesitated at first, worried about negative portrayal. But the Fair Lane Restoration Committee supported him, and Maria Chen helped him access records. Marcus keeps filming, with permission or without it. "They can't stop me from telling this story," he says, "because it's not their story to control. It belongs to the people who lived it." His film premieres next year, not at Sundance, in local theaters in Detroit, in union halls, in high schools, places where the descendants of Chen Wei and Margaret Walsh can finally see their families recognized. Marcus isn't the only person reading these buildings differently. In Ann Arbor, a group of architecture students are doing the same thing, but with different tools. Not a camera. Measuring tape, 3D software, critical theory. 3 students. 1 question. Is architecture control? The course is called Architecture and Power. Professor Sarah Chen. Assignment: analyze Ford's buildings as systems of control. 3 students stand out. Maya Rodriguez, 23, graduate student focused on labor history. James Park, 22, undergraduate studying spatial analysis. Aisha Williams, 24, graduate student in critical theory. They did fieldwork at Fair Lane and the worker houses. The same day, Robert Chen drank coffee on his porch. The same day, Jennifer Morrison led a tour. But they didn't take the tour. They measured. Maya focuses on light. Specifically, windows. Her thesis, Control Through Illumination. Henry Ford's bedroom at Fair Lane, large south-facing windows, 180 square feet of glass. A worker house bedroom, small north-facing windows, 12 square feet of glass. A 15-to-1 ratio. Ford had 15 times the advantage in natural light. Why? Maya explains in her presentation. It's not just money. Big windows lose heat. Yes, Ford could afford it, but workers could too, if they were paid to. This is about controlling visibility. Ford looks outward. Workers are kept in shadow. Who gets to see and who is kept unseen? That is power. She pauses, then says the line that silences the room. Light isn't about beauty. It's about power. James takes a different approach. He builds a 3D digital model and layers Fair Lane over the worker district. 3 miles in distance. A different universe in class. But James's model reveals something else. A vertical relationship. Fair Lane sits higher. The worker district sits lower. From Fair Lane, you can see the worker streets. From the worker streets, you can't see Fair Lane through the trees. Every design decision is a decision about power, James says. No window is just a window. No road is just a road. He shows the model to Robert Chen, a man who has lived in that house for 67 years. Robert stares at the screen for a long time. Then he says, I never thought about it like that. But it makes sense. Of course he wanted to be on top. And of course he didn't want us to see him. Aisha brings theory. Foucault, panopticon, distributed power. Ford didn't build one watchtower, she says. He built an entire surveillance landscape. Fair Lane is the high point. The factories are the ring. The worker houses are the cells. And the hydroelectric dam? That's not just electricity. That's control of water. Power in the most literal sense over people living downstream. Her argument is simple. Ford didn't build products. He built an ecosystem of control. And architecture, the beautiful buildings we admire, was one of its tools. These buildings aren't relics, Professor Chen says, summarizing. They're evidence. Evidence of how power works. And that evidence is still speaking. Marcus with his camera. Maya, James, and Aisha, with measurements and theory. Different tools. Same refusal. They don't ask, what was Ford thinking when he built this? They ask, what can we see here that Ford didn't want us to see? And by asking that question, They do what preservation alone can't. They turn legacy from something handed to us into something we actively analyze. And in that question, not about what Henry Ford built, not about what we preserved, but about what we reclaim, about how people take spaces shaped by power and demand they answer to the present. That struggle isn't in history books, it's happening now. What do we do with this legacy? The answer depends on who you ask, and more importantly, who gets to claim the right to answer. There are people who own Ford's legacy in ways no museum records, no tour mentions, no preservation board recognizes. They own it through their hands, through their bodies, through the daily weight of living with it. Two women, two kinds of ownership. Neither one asked for this. Both carry it. Ownership isn't a choice. It's a burden that gets handed to you. Let's start with the person most visitors never see. Fairlane, 5 a.m. The lights are off, except for a few dim maintenance bulbs. No tourists, no guides, just keys turning in locks and footsteps on hardwood. Sarah Martinez, 52 years old, lead custodian at the Fairlane Museum. She's worked here for 18 years. She came to the U.S. from Mexico in 1992, at 19. Restaurants, hotels, office buildings. Anywhere that needed someone to clean up what other people left behind. In 2007, she got a job at Fairlane, a good job, stable, health insurance. And slowly, over years, she learned something no tour teaches. She knows this house better than anyone. Her shift runs from 5 a.m. to 1 p.m. Before the visitors arrive, after they leave. She sees the building when it's empty, when it's itself, not a performance. Every morning is the same routine. Vacuum the carpets, dust the furniture, polish the wood floors, clean the glass, and polish the doorknobs. There's one doorknob she thinks about more than the others, the entrance to Henry Ford's study. Brass, heavy, slightly pitted around the edges, even with weekly polishing. Sarah polishes it 5 days a week. She's done that for 18 years. Then one day she stopped and realized something. I've touched this doorknob more than Henry Ford ever did. She ran the numbers. Henry Ford lived at Fairlane from 1915 to 1947. 32 years. Maybe he went into that study, on average, once a day, some days more. Some days not at all. 10,000 times, at most. Sarah, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, 18 years. About 4,600 times a year. More than 82,000 touches. She smiles when she thinks about it, not because it's funny, because it's unsettling. Who owns that room, she asks herself, the person who built it, or the person who keeps it alive every day? And it isn't just the doorknob. Sarah knows which floorboards creak, which windows leak when it rains, which heater fails every February, which pipe rattles when you turn on the second-floor faucet. She knows because she lives with the building, not as a resident, as a caretaker. Visitors see preserved beauty. They don't see Sarah at 6 a.m. wiping down the same surfaces. Guides say Fairlane is maintained in pristine condition. They don't say her name. And here's the part she hesitates to admit, but it's true. She loves the building. She loves the living room ceiling with its intricate plasterwork. The ceiling she climbs up to dust, month after month, while tourists photograph it once. She loves the stained glass window on the staircase, the one she cleans with a special solution, careful not to scratch it. She loves the library with the old books, the books she dusts every week that visitors aren't allowed to touch. Preservation isn't freezing something, she told me during a rare interview. It's work every day. If I stop, this building starts dying immediately. Dust builds in a week. Wood dries out in a month. Mold appears if humidity isn't controlled. Preservation is non-stop labor, and most of it is invisible. After 18 years, Sarah has a question. When I retire, who will know I was here? There's no memorial plaque for the people who clean, only for the people who fund. The archives have Ford family photos. They even have servant records from the 1920s, documents that Maria found. But there's nothing documenting the staff who keep the place alive now, no record of the present. In 2023, Sarah raised it with the museum director. Shouldn't we archive today too? He cared, but there wasn't budget for contemporary staff documentation. Maybe someday. That's the irony she lives with. The museum preserves labor from the past. It remembers the people who worked here 100 years ago, but it doesn't record the labor of the present. History is still happening, Sarah said. We just don't see it until it becomes the past. So she started keeping her own journal. Notes about the building, about the work, about what she notices. Her private archive, because no one else will make it. Maybe one day someone will care that Sarah Martinez touched that doorknob 46,800 times, that she knew this building in a way Henry Ford never did. Not as an owner, as a caretaker. Sarah owns Fair Lane through her labor. But 30 miles away, another woman owns a piece of Ford's empire in a different way, through blood, through inheritance. And she isn't sure she wants it. Catherine Walsh, 41 years old, high school teacher, single mom of 2, and the 4th generation living in the same Ford worker house. Her great-grandmother, Margaret Walsh, was the sister of Bridget O'Connor, the head housekeeper we met earlier. Margaret was a factory worker. She bought this house in 1922, $800, with a loan through the company housing program. Catherine's grandmother lived here. Her mother lived here. And now, Catherine. 4th generation. She didn't choose it. She inherited it in 2019, when her mother died. No siblings to share the weight. And that's exactly what it is. A weight. Property taxes, $5,200 a year. In 1995, when her mother inherited it, $1,800. The house is worth about $210,000 today. In 1995, it was around $45,000. Catherine teaches in the public school system. She makes $58,000 a year. After taxes, mortgage, utilities, she has about $800 a month left for everything else. And this 100-year-old house always needs something. The roof leaked last year. $8,000. A foundation crack. $12,000. The electrical system needs to be updated to modern code. $6,500. And because the house is considered, quote, Catherine can't always do the cheapest fix. She's pressured to use, quote, period-appropriate materials. That adds 30 to 40%. People tell me I'm lucky to inherit a historic home, Catherine says. But what does lucky mean when you can't afford to keep it? Developers call her every month. They can smell the pressure. They offer cash, $250,000. They'll turn it into a short-term rental. Or a luxury historic cottage. Her kids, 8 and 11, don't want the house. It's old. It's weird. Their friends think it's strange to live in history. They want a newer place, a bigger yard, and no tourists photographing their front door. But Catherine knows the story. She has letters from Margaret. These are the letters Maria found in the Fair Lane archives. Margaret Walsh worked brutal hours so her family could own this place. 4 generations fought to keep it. Selling feels like betraying sacrifice, but staying feels like financial drowning. Credit card debt to cover repairs, money that should go to her kids' future, rerouted into foundation cracks and roof patches. Some nights she sits at the kitchen table and runs the numbers until the house goes quiet. My great-grandmother fought to own this house, Catherine says. Now I'm fighting not to lose it. And sometimes I'm not even sure what the difference is. Community pressure doesn't help. The Historical Society wants her to stay. Authenticity matters. If all the descendants sell, the neighborhood loses its soul. But some neighbors want her to sell because it boosts everyone's property values. Catherine is trapped inside a question no one can answer for her. Legacy for who? If only the wealthy can afford historic homes, then preservation turns into displacement. The worker houses remain. But workers, and their descendants, can't live in them. The irony completes itself. In 2024, Catherine still hasn't decided. She's still there, still paying the taxes, still patching the house. But for how long? History shouldn't be something only rich people can afford to live with, she says. But more and more, that's exactly what it's becoming. But Catherine isn't alone. Across the neighborhood, other families are facing the same choice. Some are selling, some are holding on, and some have decided. Enough. If we want to keep these spaces for the people who fought for them, we have to fight. Not alone. Together. One night in March 2022, Catherine sits in her living room with 14 neighbors. Robert Chen. 4 other families from 14th Street. 5 families from 12th Street. 3 from 16th. They're all descendants, and they're all trapped in the same equation. Taxes rising faster than incomes. Developers calling every month. Pressure to sell getting heavier every year. If we all sell, Robert says, this won't be a worker neighborhood anymore. It'll be Airbnbs and luxury condos. The houses get preserved, but the history gets erased. A younger woman, Maria Rodriguez, 32, granddaughter of a Ford worker, has done the research. There's something called an affordable housing overlay district, she says. If we can combine it with the historic designation, we can protect both the history and the affordability. It's not a crazy idea. Other cities have done versions of it. Somerville, Massachusetts, Richmond, California. They created community land trusts, where families own the house, but the land is held in trust, keeping prices affordable forever. We're going to have to fight, Catherine says. The city wants tax revenue. Developers have lawyers. And some neighbors want their property values to rise. But if we don't fight, we lose everything. The question moves through the room. Who's willing to fight? 14 hands go up. They start simple. Knocking on doors. Talking to neighbors. Explaining the plan. In 3 months, they get 47 families to commit. Not everyone, but enough to start. They form an organization, the Dearborn Worker Housing Preservation Coalition. No office, no staff, just people who live in these houses deciding they're not going to quietly disappear. They hire a land use attorney, a woman named Jennifer Park. She's helped build similar protections in Oakland. Cost? $50,000 to get through the legal process. They fundraise. Every family gives what they can. Some give $100. Some give $1,000. Robert gives $5,000 from his retirement savings. $42,000 in 6 months. Not enough, but close. Maria sets up a GoFundMe, Help Preserve Worker History. It spreads. Marcus Williams starts filming their fight for his documentary, and that attention brings more eyes. 8,000 more comes from strangers online. 50,000. They can hire the lawyer. Now comes the hard part. Their strategy is simple on paper. Petition the city's zoning board to create a historic affordable housing overlay district. The historic designation already exists, but it protects architecture, not affordability. Their plan is to combine preservation with affordability restrictions. Houses can't be converted into Airbnbs. They can't be flipped into luxury condos. They must remain primary homes. Opposition shows up immediately. The Dearborn Developers Association fights it. They have 7 attorneys. They argue affordability rules violate property rights. Some neighbors oppose it too. People who want to sell high, people who treat home value like their retirement plan. And the city hesitates. More expensive homes mean higher tax revenue. Affordable protections mean less. First hearing, March 2023. More than 200 people show up. The room overflows. They move it into the larger auditorium. Catherine testifies. Robert testifies. Maria presents legal precedent. Developers argue free markets and property rights. The board votes. 5 against, 4 in favor. Denied. Reason: not enough neighborhood support. They need 60% of nearby households. They have 45. The coalition doesn't quit. They knock again. They hold block meetings. They explain how a land trust works. Some people change their minds once they understand. This isn't the government taking your home. It's families voluntarily placing their homes into a trust to keep them affordable. You still own your house. You can still sell it. But you sell it to another family who will live there, not a developer. 2 years. 2 years of door knocking. Council meetings. Letters to the editor. Community events. Media interviews. In May 2024, they refile. This time, 58% neighborhood support. Still not 60, but close enough to make the board nervous. The board votes. 5 in favor, 4 against. Approved. But there's a compromise. Not all 20 streets. Only 12. The streets with the strongest support. 8 other streets remain standard zoning. The market will decide their fate. Not a perfect win, but a win. 12 streets, about 120 homes, now have protection. Families can voluntarily place their homes into the Dearborn Worker Housing Trust. They still own the house, but when they sell, it has to remain affordable for the next family. Property taxes get capped based on income. Catherine now pays $3,200 a year instead of $5,200, $2,000 a year. It doesn't solve everything, but it lets her breathe. Robert places his home into the trust immediately. My grandfather would want this, he says. Catherine is still deciding. Her kids still don't want the house, but for the first time, she has options. And the other 8 streets? Gentrification continues. Airbnbs open. Families leave. History gets preserved, only for people who can afford it. Not a fairy tale ending. Not everyone is saved. But 120 families have a victory, the kind of victory Margaret Walsh would recognize. Some people fight, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they win. And Sarah? At Fair Lane, the museum pays attention to the media coverage. Marcus films Sarah. He tells the story of the doorknob, and the director calls her into his office. We want to start an archive project for current staff, he says. No budget. They find one. A small grant. $2,500. Enough to begin. A University of Michigan intern will interview staff, record their stories, photograph them at work. Sarah will be the first. Which doorknob do you touch the most? The intern asks. Sarah laughs. Henry Ford's study. I have touched it 46,800 times. The intern stops, writes the number down. That's exact? I did the math. Sarah's own archive, her journal, kept for 5 years, becomes part of the museum collection. Not buried in storage. Displayed. In a glass case beside Bridget O'Connor's journal from the 1920s. Label. Sarah Martinez, lead custodian, 2007 present. Daily care logs preserving Fair Lane. History isn't only the past. It's happening right now. And now, someone is recording it. Fair Lane. Late afternoon. Sarah finishes her shift. She polishes one last doorknob, Henry Ford's study, like always, and gets ready to leave. She stands at the main entrance and looks into the Great Hall. 110 years ago, this house was built to declare power, to control the people around it, to make Ford feel immortal. It failed at all of that. Ford died. Control collapsed. Power scattered. But the house still stands. Not because Ford willed it, because people like Sarah choose to keep it standing, because people like Catherine fight to keep space for the descendants of the ones who built it, because people like Marcus refuse to let the story be told only by the powerful. Sarah opens the front door. Late sunlight spills in. She steps outside, and the door stays open behind her. Legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you fight for. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, you win. What do we do with this legacy? The answer isn't inside a museum. It's in what we choose to do with these spaces, who we allow to live in them, who we remember built them, what stories we decide to tell about them. Henry Ford built Fair Lane to control the world around him. But the world can't be controlled. It can only be lived in, fought for, transformed, one doorknob at a time, one house at a time, one decision at a time. The door is open. What you do with that invitation? That's the question. But before you step through that doorway, let me leave you with 4 things. 1. Architecture is never just a building. It's a tool of power, and every design choice encodes who gets comfort and who doesn't. 2. History is made by invisible labor, by people like Bridget, Margaret, and Sarah, not by the people who simply owned the deed. 3. Perfect control always loses to adaptation, whether it's the Amazon swallowing Fordlandia or a Brazilian community turning it into something Ford never wanted. And 4. Legacy isn't something you passively inherit. It's something you fight for, every day. One doorknob at a time, one house at a time, one decision at a time. Thank you for staying with me for these 99 minutes. That's a serious investment of your time, and I don't take it lightly. If this story hit you, if it changed how you see the buildings around you, or who really owns history, hit like. Subscribe if you want more deep investigations into the real cost of perfection. And leave a comment. Is there an architectural legacy in your community that's being fought over right now? Who's battling to define what it means? 110 years ago, Henry Ford built Fair Lane as a machine of control. Today, those buildings are in the hands of people choosing to turn them into tools of liberation. The choice, like it always has been, is ours.